Hello everyone. Every ICU physician has seen this scenario. Ferritin is elevated, serum iron is low, hemoglobin is falling. You know that during sepsis, the body is deliberately trying to hide this iron. Every physiology textbook teaches this. Yet, when we see low iron levels, our first instinct is to often replace it. Today, we'll understand the use of IV iron in ICU. Welcome to ICU Physiology Insights, where the goal is to move beyond surface level thinking. On this channel, we discuss pathophysiology, mechanisms, and evidence in medicine. Now, IV iron is very useful in iron deficiency, especially in those who are unable to absorb oral iron. However, in this lecture, we'll focus on the use of IV iron in patients with anemia with ongoing inflammation, for example, sepsis. We'll answer these two questions in this lecture. How is IV iron metabolized? And what happens when you give IV iron while body is in inflammatory state? Once you understand the concepts, you should be able to figure out when you should use IV iron. Now, how can you give iron in IV form? Since ferrous iron is highly reactive, you cannot just inject ferrous sulfate in your patient. Therefore, we use ferric iron. But since ferric form is insoluble, it is bound to carbohydrate shell, forming a nanoparticle called ferroxide. The macrophages in the spleen, liver, and bone marrow internalize these IV iron nanoparticles via scavenger receptors. Inside the endolysosome, the pH is acidic and there are iron-reducing enzymes, which help dissolve the carbohydrate shell and convert ferric into ferrous form, which is released into your cytosolic labile iron pool. Now, this iron can then be used to form heme in mitochondria stored as ferritin or exported out of cell via ferroportin channel. These are the three common IV formulations used, named after carbohydrates used for the shell. For example, iron gluconate, iron sucrose, and iron carboxymaltose. Their different molecular weights define the rate of dissociation. Since we do not want to overwhelm the system with iron, slower dissociation of IV iron formulation is preferred. Iron sucrose is the most commonly used. Now let's see how this iron is used. In human body, most of the iron, about 2.5 gram, is in the form of hemoglobin inside the RBCs, with about 1 gram as storage as ferritin. However, you can see that the amount of iron managed by the transferrin is only 3 to 4 milligrams, which is easily saturable by one dose of 300 milligrams of iron sucrose that we give. One consequence of this is greatly increased in the non-transferrin bound iron in the plasma before this iron can be taken up by the cells. When giving iron, we are always concerned about two problems with iron. First, the excess ferrous form inside the cell can increase the oxidative stress. And second, excess non-transferrin bound iron in plasma can be used by pathogens for replication. So the question is, how much and for how long does non-transferrin bound plasma iron remains elevated after IV iron infusion, as this will directly dictate the complications associated with iron. In this long follow-up study, the non-transferrin bound plasma iron was elevated 100 folds when iron sucrose was given and remained elevated for at least 30 to 40 hours. We'll keep this fact in mind when we discuss other pathophysiological consequences of IV iron, as anti-BI drives many of them. Now, before we go further, let's quickly recap why serum iron was lower in inflammatory conditions. Here, the goal of the body was to attempt to starve the pathogens of essential nutrients, iron, and we learned that this was achieved by the hormone hepcidin and various cytokines, though it came with problems like ferroptosis, exhaustion of macrophages, and erythroid arrest in the bone marrow. Now let's see what happens when IV iron is given to a septic patient, when body is actively trying to minimize serum iron. First, we'll discuss the effect on various immune cells. So let's start with macrophages first. Since macrophages recycle old RBCs, they tend to have higher intracellular iron levels due to loss of ferroportin. This creates oxidative stress from Fenton reaction, which diverts cell towards HIF-alpha stabilization. Now, HIF-alpha enables cells to adapt to hypoxia, inflammation, and metabolic stress, and this tends to activate macrophages further to produce more cytokines and hepcidin, thus creating a loop. And macrophages can become locked into this pro-inflammatory phenotypes, impairing the normal resolution of inflammation. This process only gets supercharged with more IV iron, More ROS stabilizes more HIF-1 alpha, producing more inflammatory cytokines and hepcidin. Once locked into this phase, cells start favoring aerobic glycolysis and inhibit key enzymes of the Krebs cycle. This results in accumulation of citrate and succinate. Now, rise in intracellular citrate will result in production of more nitric oxide, causing further vasodilation. Now, NTBI can stimulate the eNOS directly to produce nitric oxide as well. And this is one of the reasons why flushing and hypotension is seen during IV iron transfusions. In patients with sepsis, this has potential to further their hypotension. Similarly, buildup of succinate reinforces the stabilization of HIF-1 alpha further. But these are macrophages. What about those cells that need iron, for example, erythroid progenitors? It is logical to conclude that IV iron is going to help these cells. However, mechanisms are always more complex than what they appear on the surface. During the inflammation, not only the erythroid progenitors are starved of iron, they are also actively suppressed by TNF-alpha, which preferentially stimulates myeloid progenitors to fight the infection. Not only this, the interferon gamma also actively stimulates macrophages to clear up old senescent and damaged RBCs, a process we call erythrophagocytosis. Now, giving iron in the situation enables more pro-inflammatory locking, producing more hepcidin and cytokines. These further increase the erythroid suppression and increase erythrophagocytosis. So, IV iron in septic individuals may not increase the hemoglobin levels as seen in a normal individual. In less severe inflammation, for example, CKD and heart failure, you might be able to make some red blood cells. But even then, the rise of hemoglobin is very low. In trials like DRIVE-1 and DRIVE-2, which used IV iron in CKD, the rise in hemoglobin was only to the order of 0.5 gram per DL. Even the KidGO guidelines recommend iron therapy in anemia, though certainty of evidence is deemed pretty low. Now let's look at the neutrophils. Neutrophils rely on NADPH oxidase to convert molecular oxygen into superoxide and hydrogen peroxide. This is then subsequently converted into hypochlorous acid, which is used to fight bacteria. Now, when you give IV iron, this excess iron shunts the hydrogen peroxide to formation of hydroxyl radicals. So instead of killing bacteria, PMNs now have to focus on neutralizing the free radicals generated by IV iron rather than neutralizing these bacteria. Further, excess iron disrupts the polarization of that actin cytoskeleton, which neutrophils need for a chemotactic response. And there are many basic science research suggesting that IV iron may decrease phagocytosis in both gram-negative and gram-positive organisms. Now let's look at the T cells. Like any other cells, T cells use iron as they need it for rapid cell division when they encounter a pathogen. So it would seem logical that IV iron can help these cells. However, things are far more complicated. It seems that not only the amount, but also the form of iron is required to regulate T cell proliferation. Now, T cell proliferation requires rapid influx of iron, so they upregulate transferrin receptor 1 on the T cell membrane to capture the transferrin-bound iron. However, when you increase the labile iron pool with IV iron, the iron regulatory proteins bind to iron and detach it from iron-responsive elements on the transferrin mRNA. This leads to transferrin mRNA degradation, and without the signal, the clonal expansion is hindered. Too much labile iron in the cytoplasm also reduces the activity of chaperone proteins, which is needed to carry iron inside mitochondria. In this study, all forms of IV iron showed dose-dependent increase in reactive oxygen species formation and decreased survival of CD4 cells and monocytes. Now, excess iron in the form of NTBI can also be taken by the endothelial cell by non-specific transporters like ZIP8 and ZIP14, which are upregulated in case of sepsis. This excess labile iron pool in endothelium produces hydroxyl radical, and since endothelial cells also make nitric oxide, these hydroxyl can react with nitric oxide to form nitrosyl radicals, which result in endothelial damage and vasoplegia, which you see commonly in sepsis. This oxidative stress can also cleave the glycocalyx and internalize the cadherin molecules. If you remember, the cadherins were the component of the tight junction between the endothelial cells. Once they are lost, it results in leaky endothelial junction and capillary leak. Further, adhesion molecules like VCAM1 start trapping leukocytes, and exocytosis of the Weber pellet bodies, which releases von Willebrand factor, initiates microvascular thrombosis. Simultaneously with failing defenses, non-transferrin bound iron acts as an extra serving of iron for the microbes. We know that the availability of iron dictates whether a certain bacterium will transition into invasive, highly virulent state or remains quiet. These mechanisms we just discussed sound like IV iron is a pretty bad idea for ongoing sepsis, but the question remains, does this biological plausibility really translates to poorer clinical outcomes? Unfortunately, there are no randomized controlled trial on IV iron in sepsis, but we do have some studies for the use of iron in other chronic inflammatory diseases and anemia. This is the largest meta-analysis to date on use of IV iron so far. This study showed 16% increase in risk of infection with IV iron use. The authors do make a note of moderate certainty of evidence, noting number needed to harm is 1 in 62. It also showed increased hemoglobin levels. However, the rise in hemoglobin was only to the order of 0.5 gram per dl. Now, there are three problems with this number. First, they did not report how long after the infusion did this hemoglobin rise by this amount, and my suspicion that this probably took a long time, at least 2 to 4 weeks or possibly longer, to achieve this. The second question you have to ask is this increase of 0.5 gram per dl clinically meaningful? Lastly, the heterogeneity in the study was very high, to the order of 94%. This means that there was a lot of difference between the groups in etiology, demographics, and other factors. Another physiological consequence of IV iron is hypophosphatemia. Iron upregulates the gene producing fibroblast growth factor. It also blocks the enzyme that breaks it down. This results in high levels of fibroblast growth factor. Fibroblast growth factor internalizes renal phosphate transporter proteins in the kidneys, resulting in massive renal phosphate wasting. The resulting hypophosphatemia depletes ATP and 2,3-BPG, causing severe muscle weakness, both respiratory and cardiac. This side effect is worse with ferric carboxymaltose. Another problem with IV iron is CARPA, complement activation related pseudo-allergy. This is not a true allergy. The carbohydrate cell of IV iron mimics the bacterial surfaces, and this triggers lectin and alternate complement pathways. This releases C3A, C5A, which triggers the mast cell degranulation, and thromboxane A2 is produced by pulmonary macrophages. The symptom of CARP, therefore, is bronchospasm, chest tightness, flushing, and lower back and groin pain. Since it is a rate of iron release that causes CARPA, slowing down the rate or using IV iron with slower release resolves the problem. Now we understand how IV iron affects septic patient. Let's answer the question, when should we give IV iron in ICU? And here I want you to use common sense. Let's ask the first question. What is that we are trying to achieve with IV iron? And the most common answer you get is depleting iron stores for iron deficiency and improve hemoglobin levels. So my first question is, how do you even diagnose iron deficiency in sepsis? The lab tests like ferritin, serum iron, and percent transferrin sats are not specific for diagnosing iron deficiency in septic condition. I have a great article from ASH which lays good foundation for interpreting these tests. The link is in description below. Okay, let's say that patient is iron deficient. The second question you should ask is, would you be able to achieve the goal of increasing hemoglobin? Do you expect the hemoglobin to rise in few days of IV iron? And the answer is no. Even in a normal iron deficient state, the rise in hemoglobin takes 1 to 2 weeks before it increases by 1 to 2 gram per dl. In inflammatory state, you can possibly see a rise of 0.5 gram per dl in a week or two. But the question here to ask is that slow increase clinically meaningful? Now, there are definite risks of IV iron as we discussed. And since that IV iron is not achieving any perceivable benefit immediately for a patient, the common sense dictates that this IV iron can be given later at a more appropriate time when your patient has improved and can assimilate the IV iron. Now, use of IV iron has been shown to reduce blood transfusions and have some beneficial effect on hemoglobin levels on long term. So I'm not against the use of IV iron. I'm just suggesting that there's always a more appropriate time and place where you can use IV iron. Commonly, I would give IV iron to the patient when the patient are ready to be discharged to the floor. Now, if you look hard enough, you'll come across these type of retrospective studies. Now, this is a 2026 ASH poster presentation, and unfortunately, many doctors on social media started quoting this study as a reason to give IV iron in sepsis. I would like you to read this and examine the limitation of study yourself, and it's okay if you cannot. We physicians are not taught rigors of statistical method. The study was a poster, so I could not find complete methodology. However, there are not one but several serious limitations of the study. Please pause the video and go through it. Now, I am not opposed to exploratory studies such as this, as we don't know the right answer. However, when presenting their finding, physicians should certainly take great care to accurately convey the study's limitation and uncertainties, particularly when the conclusions could affect the management of patient for whom the consequences may be severe or even fatal. RCT will most likely answer this question, but will be difficult to conduct given problems with IV iron and sepsis. However, if you are conducting a retrospective or a prospective study, I would suggest several measures to improve the accuracy of your conclusions. Some of these are listed here. At a minimum, the factors discussed here should be carefully controlled for adequate balance between the two groups. Hope this was helpful. Thank you.